The war enters a dangerous new phase. 5 days. That's all it took for a fragile ceasefire to collapse and push the Middle East back toward the edge of a much wider conflict. Only weeks earlier, diplomats meeting in Switzerland had spoken with cautious optimism after reaching an agreement designed to halt hostilities, reopen negotiations, and restore stability to the Strait of Hormuz, one of the world's most strategically important waterways. For a brief moment, there were genuine signs of progress. Commercial shipping slowly resumed, oil markets began to stabilize, and international observers cautiously discussed the possibility that the Gulf might finally be entering a period of relative calm. Today, however, that optimism has almost completely disappeared. Instead of diplomatic meetings dominating the headlines, the world is once again watching military operations unfold across the region. As Wednesday began, the United States confirmed another coordinated series of strikes against Iranian military positions. According to American officials, the operation targeted assets believed to be threatening commercial vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz. Iran responded almost immediately. Air defense systems were activated across Tehran as authorities reported fresh attacks, while Iranian state media announced retaliatory operations against facilities linked to American military activities in Bahrain and Kuwait. Within hours, military action had spread across multiple countries, demonstrating how quickly the confrontation had expanded beyond a single maritime corridor into a broader regional crisis. What makes this escalation particularly striking is not only its intensity, but the speed with which the diplomatic progress of recent weeks has been replaced by renewed military confrontation. Perhaps the clearest indication that the ceasefire is no longer functioning came from Tehran itself. Speaking to Iranian state media, senior official Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf stated that Iran no longer saw any practical reason to continue honoring an agreement that, in its view, had failed to deliver meaningful results. Although neither Washington nor Tehran has formally declared the ceasefire over, statements like these strongly suggest that the diplomatic framework created only weeks ago is rapidly losing its relevance. For governments monitoring the crisis, for global energy markets reacting to every new development, and for millions of people whose daily lives depend on stable oil supplies, the question is no longer whether the fighting has resumed. It already has. The real uncertainty now is how much further this conflict can spread, and whether the next phase will remain largely confined to the Gulf or evolve into something with far wider regional and global consequences. A warning heard around the world. As the ceasefire continued to unravel, the tone between Washington and Tehran changed dramatically. The cautious diplomatic language that had briefly offered hope for de-escalation was quickly replaced by increasingly direct warnings and public threats. Late Tuesday evening, President Donald Trump delivered one of his strongest messages since the latest fighting began, warning that if Iran refused to return to negotiations, the United States was prepared to expand its military campaign. Among the potential targets he mentioned were major bridges and power infrastructure, facilities whose destruction could significantly disrupt Iran's transportation and energy networks. When asked whether Tehran would be given a final deadline before such action, Trump declined to set a timetable. Instead, he offered a brief but unmistakable warning, saying Iran already understood what was at stake and that it had better behave. Although the statement lasted only seconds, it immediately drew worldwide attention, with governments and military analysts interpreting it as a sign that Washington was prepared to intensify military operations if diplomacy failed. Later that day, speaking before defense officials and international delegates, Trump expanded on his position, arguing that, despite its public rhetoric, Tehran appeared increasingly interested in reaching a negotiated settlement. According to him, the coming days would determine whether diplomacy could still succeed or whether the conflict would continue to unfold on the battlefield. Iran responded with a sharply different perspective. Senior official Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf argued that the country's national security depended on preserving what he described as Iran's rightful role in managing the Strait of Hormuz. From Tehran's point of view, the dispute was never simply about commercial shipping lanes, but about sovereignty, regional influence, and long-term national security. Ghalibaf went further, suggesting that diplomacy and military action were not separate choices, but complementary parts of the same broader strategy, with negotiations continuing only if they served Iran's national interests. By framing the confrontation in existential terms, Iranian officials signaled that the conflict was no longer being viewed as a temporary political disagreement, but as a struggle directly connected to the country's future, making compromise increasingly difficult for either side. At the same time, President Trump's renewed references to striking bridges and electrical infrastructure revived concerns that had largely faded during the ceasefire. Earlier in the year, similar statements had prompted criticism from international legal experts and United Nations officials, who argued that deliberate attacks on civilian infrastructure could raise serious questions under international humanitarian law if they disrupted essential public services. Those concerns have now returned with renewed urgency as military operations continue across multiple fronts, and public rhetoric grows increasingly confrontational. Although diplomatic channels remain open, they are becoming harder to hear amid the escalation. With every warning, every retaliatory statement, and every new military operation, negotiations move further into the background, increasing the risk that future decisions will be shaped less by diplomats around negotiating tables and more by military commanders directing events on the ground. A rare moment of hope. As fighter jets crossed the skies and missile strikes continued to reshape the battlefield, an unexpected announcement briefly interrupted the cycle of escalation. For the first time in days, the headlines shifted away from military operations toward a rare humanitarian development. President Donald Trump announced that an American citizen who had been detained in Iran since December of the previous year had been released. In a message shared on his social media platform, he confirmed that she had safely left Iranian territory and described the release as a gesture of goodwill from Tehran. Shortly afterward, her legal representatives confirmed that she was already on her way back to the United States, bringing months of uncertainty to an end for her family. Against the backdrop of an expanding regional conflict, the announcement stood out because it offered something that had become increasingly uncommon, a reminder that communication between Washington and Tehran had not disappeared completely. The timing of the release immediately raised an important question. Was this the first sign of renewed diplomacy, or simply an isolated humanitarian decision with no broader political significance? At this stage, no one could answer with certainty. The announcement came while both governments continued accusing one another of violating previous commitments, expanding military operations, and exchanging increasingly direct public warnings. Under those circumstances, even a limited humanitarian gesture attracted global attention. Throughout modern history, prisoner releases, medical exchanges, and other humanitarian agreements have often served a unique purpose. While they rarely resolve major international disputes on their own, they frequently preserve the last remaining channels of communication between opposing governments when formal negotiations have stalled. Even during periods of active conflict, these quiet diplomatic contacts have often helped prevent complete political isolation. Whether this latest release represents the beginning of a broader diplomatic effort remains impossible to determine. It may prove to be an isolated act with little long-term political impact, or it could become the first small step toward rebuilding dialogue after weeks of escalating violence. For now, neither Washington nor Tehran has indicated that comprehensive negotiations are about to resume. Military operations continue, public rhetoric remains confrontational, and the ceasefire negotiated only weeks ago appears increasingly fragile. Even so, the release serves as a reminder that diplomacy rarely disappears all at once. Sometimes it survives through small acts of trust that keep communication alive until conditions become more favorable for meaningful negotiations. Whether this moment eventually marks the beginning of renewed dialogue or simply a brief pause in an increasingly dangerous confrontation will depend entirely on the decisions both governments make in the days ahead. Operation Wednesday. As Wednesday unfolded, it became increasingly clear that the latest American offensive was far more extensive than initially reported. What first appeared to be a limited military strike quickly revealed itself as a coordinated campaign carried out in multiple phases, each targeting a different layer of Iran's military infrastructure. According to U.S. officials, the primary objective was to reduce Tehran's ability to threaten commercial shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, one of the world's most strategically important maritime corridors. Earlier in the day, American forces announced that they had degraded several Iranian maritime capabilities and confirmed an encounter with a vessel that allegedly attempted to breach the recently reinstated naval blockade around Iranian ports. One of the campaign's central objectives was Greater Tunb Island, a strategically located position overlooking the entrance to the Strait of Hormuz. U.S. aircraft reportedly spent nearly 90 minutes striking coastal defense batteries, cruise missile storage sites, launch facilities, and supporting military infrastructure that officials said played a key role in monitoring and threatening commercial traffic through the waterway. As daylight faded, the operation entered a second phase. U.S. Central Command confirmed another wave of coordinated airstrikes, expanding the campaign well beyond its initial objectives. This phase focused on command and control centers, air defense systems, drone facilities, missile infrastructure, and coastal surveillance installations across southern Iran. Among the reported targets was Bandar Abbas, Iran's largest port on the Strait of Hormuz, and one of the country's most significant naval and commercial hubs. The scope of the operation suggested a broader strategy than simply destroying individual military sites. Instead, it appeared designed to systematically weaken Iran's ability to coordinate future military operations across the Gulf by targeting multiple layers of its defensive network at the same time. Rather than a single strike, Wednesday's offensive represented a sustained effort to reduce operational capabilities across a wide range of strategic assets. The consequences, however, extended beyond military objectives. As explosions were reported in several locations, air defense sirens sounded across Tehran, while emergency response systems were activated. Iranian state media also reported that a hospital in the city of Avaz was evacuated after nearby missile strikes raised concerns for the safety of patients and medical staff. Whether the hospital itself was directly targeted remains unclear, but the evacuation underscored a broader reality of modern warfare. Even when military facilities are the intended objectives, the effects often reach surrounding civilian communities. Disruptions to hospitals, emergency services, and daily life illustrate how quickly conflict can extend beyond the battlefield. By the end of Wednesday, it had become evident that this was not an isolated military operation, but another major escalation in a conflict growing steadily in both scale and intensity, with diplomacy appearing increasingly difficult as each new round of strikes pushed the two sides further apart. The conflict crosses new borders. As American airstrikes continued along Iran's southern coastline, Tehran made it clear that its response would not remain confined to its own territory. According to Iranian state media, the country's armed forces launched drones toward facilities in Jordan believed to support American military communications and logistical operations, signaling that any nation hosting or supporting U.S. military activities in the region could also become part of the confrontation. Jordanian authorities responded swiftly, confirming that multiple unmanned aerial vehicles had entered the country's airspace before being intercepted by its air defense systems. Officials reported that 8 drones were successfully destroyed before reaching their intended targets, with no casualties or significant damage. Although the interception was considered a military success, it also highlighted an important reality. The conflict was no longer limited to Washington and Tehran. Jordan, Bahrain, and Kuwait had all become directly affected by military operations, despite not being central parties to the original dispute, demonstrating how rapidly the crisis was expanding beyond the Strait of Hormuz. At sea, the situation continued to evolve. U.S. Central Command confirmed that 2 commercial vessels had been redirected after approaching areas affected by the renewed naval blockade surrounding Iranian ports. The return of the blockade marked another clear sign that the ceasefire framework negotiated in Switzerland had effectively collapsed, replacing diplomatic compromise with renewed military pressure. Iran answered by warning that additional oil and gas export routes serving the United States and its regional partners could also become targets if hostilities continued. Although no specific locations or timelines were provided, the warning alone was enough to deepen uncertainty across global energy markets. Shipping companies began reassessing operational risks, insurance providers monitored developments closely, and energy traders reacted to every new military announcement, recognizing that even the possibility of further disruption could influence oil prices and commercial confidence. By the end of the day, it had become increasingly clear that this was no longer simply a confrontation between 2 governments. The conflict was steadily extending across the Middle East, affecting neighboring states, international shipping, and the global economy at the same time. What had once appeared to be a localized security dispute centered on the Strait of Hormuz was evolving into a broader regional crisis with far-reaching consequences. Every new military operation, every warning, and every country drawn into the confrontation added another layer of uncertainty, making a return to diplomacy increasingly difficult. The central question was no longer whether the conflict was expanding, but how far it might spread before meaningful negotiations could bring the escalation to an end. The global cost of a regional war. The consequences of war are not measured only by missile strikes or military objectives. Some of the most significant effects emerge far from the battlefield, appearing instead in financial markets, supply chains, factories, and households thousands of kilometers away. That is what makes the Strait of Hormuz uniquely important. As one of the world's most critical energy corridors, every military development in these waters has the potential to influence economies across the globe. As fighting intensified once again, oil prices responded almost immediately, driven not only by confirmed military operations, but also by growing uncertainty surrounding the future of commercial shipping through the Gulf. In global markets, the possibility of disruption can influence prices almost as much as disruption itself, and investors quickly began preparing for a prolonged period of instability. Several developments unfolded simultaneously. Commercial vessels were forced to adjust their routes following the return of the naval blockade. Iran warned that additional oil and gas export corridors could also face disruption, and reports of military operations affecting nearby civilian infrastructure raised fresh concerns about how much further the conflict might expand. Together, these developments signaled that the crisis was growing not only in military terms, but also in economic significance. Shipping companies faced rising insurance costs, longer transit routes, increased fuel consumption, and mounting delivery delays, while businesses dependent on predictable global supply chains found it increasingly difficult to plan future operations. Every new escalation carried the potential to reshape commercial decisions far beyond the Middle East. Governments around the world watch these developments with increasing concern because instability in the Strait of Hormuz rarely remains a regional issue. Higher transportation costs contribute to inflation, more expensive fuel affects manufacturing and agriculture, and rising energy prices ultimately increase the cost of everyday goods for consumers. Central banks reassess inflation forecasts, energy ministries review contingency plans, and financial institutions closely monitor every new military development. The Strait of Hormuz has become far more than a strategic maritime passage. It is one of the central arteries of the global economy. As long as military operations continue and diplomatic progress remains uncertain, instability itself becomes one of the conflict's most powerful consequences, reminding the world that even the possibility of disruption can reshape markets long before supplies are actually interrupted. The choice that could shape the future. As another day of fighting came to an end, one reality had become impossible to ignore. What had begun as a dispute over maritime security had grown into something far larger, testing diplomacy, reshaping regional alliances, and sending uncertainty through the global economy. With every passing hour, the space for compromise appeared to shrink. Washington and Tehran both maintained that they were acting in defense of their national interests, and neither side showed any clear sign of stepping back. History has repeatedly shown that conflicts rarely continue because both sides expect a quick victory. More often, they continue because neither believes it can afford to appear weak. Once national pride, political credibility, and military strategy become intertwined, even limited concessions become politically difficult. The Strait of Hormuz has become the clearest symbol of that reality. For some, it represents an international shipping lane that must remain open under established maritime principles. For others, it represents sovereignty, strategic influence, and regional leverage. Those competing visions are becoming increasingly difficult to reconcile, making every new development more consequential than the one before. Despite the rising tensions, however, the future has not yet been decided. From this point forward, two very different paths remain possible. One leads toward continued escalation, where military operations expand, retaliatory strikes become more frequent, additional countries are drawn into the confrontation, commercial shipping faces greater disruption, and global energy prices continue to rise. The other path is far less dramatic but considerably more difficult. It requires diplomacy to recover ground that has already been lost. It requires both governments to return to negotiations despite profound disagreements and to accept compromises that neither currently appears eager to make. History, nevertheless, demonstrates that even the most entrenched conflicts eventually reach a point where dialogue becomes the only sustainable option. Whether that moment arrives soon or only after further destruction remains impossible to know. For now, military aircraft continue patrolling the skies, naval forces remain deployed across the Gulf, and commercial crews continue navigating one of the world's most heavily militarized waterways, while governments, businesses, and financial markets watch every new development with growing concern. The Strait of Hormuz may appear small on a map, but its influence extends far beyond the Middle East. It connects energy producers with consumers across the globe, links critical trade routes, and helps sustain economic stability on every continent. That is why every decision made in these waters carries consequences that reach well beyond the immediate battlefield. A missile launched in the Gulf can influence financial markets in Europe. Disrupted shipping can affect factories across Asia. Political decisions made in Washington or Tehran can ultimately shape the daily lives of families thousands of kilometers away. In today's interconnected world, geography no longer limits the consequences of conflict. As diplomats continue searching for common ground and military leaders prepare for what may come next, the world is left waiting for an answer. Will the coming days bring another cycle of retaliation, or will they mark the beginning of renewed negotiations? No one can answer that question with certainty. What is clear is that the decisions made in the days ahead will shape not only the future of the Strait of Hormuz, but also the direction of regional stability, global energy security, and international diplomacy for years to come. Until those choices are made, one of the world's most important waterways will remain suspended between two possibilities: a gateway for global commerce, or the front line of a conflict whose consequences could be felt around the world.